Hi there, I'm Dr. Patrick Quirk, and hopefully you've been following our series of videos. Most recently we've been talking some about COVID, and in one of the COVID-related kind of presentations I talked about some of the interesting impact that this experience, that this trauma to our country has had. And one of them, as I said, a number of people who I had seen in my practice ongoing for a variety of problems, and alcohol was sort of a just beneath the surface issue. It was referenced some, but it never became that clear. In this time of being isolated, they became much more acutely aware of the nature of their problem. And so all of a sudden I had 4 and then 5 folks in my practice get very serious about recovery. And they've all gone into AA, and actually all of them are doing great, which is just amazing. That kind of success doesn't generally occur. But it really made me aware that we really need to do a good presentation just on the whole concept of alcoholism itself. That's not as quite as a trendy a topic as some of the other things that are going on, but it's still just as prevalent and just as damaging as ever been. One of the tough issues, really the toughest issue in dealing with the whole concept of alcoholism in yourself or in loved ones, is that whole issue of denial, really coming to understand that this is real, this is really going on, and there are certain things that being alcoholic means that one has to face. Okay? So a few things I think to recognize is that this disorder is much more prevalent than you might think. You know, it says 1 in 14 people struggle with alcoholism, and what that means is that those individuals may be on their way to developing alcoholism, they may be active in it, or they may be in recovery, but 1 in 14 people have at some stage of their life been active in an alcoholic practice. In truth, when I deal with my own life, it seems like the numbers are much higher than that, but I may live around a particularly select population of people. But in our short presentation today, and then we'll have a much longer one later, we're going to just talk about the most basic principle that really says what makes you an alcoholic. Because often when you're talking with people about alcoholism or about addiction in general, what they think about is physiological dependency, where you become fully addicted, that if you stop, you'll go through a withdrawal syndrome, a physiological withdrawal syndrome. Well, that's definitely an indication of alcoholism, but it's not the only indication. In fact, the very best definition, because in fact those folks are the folks that are in the worst stages, the late stages of the disease. You don't want to wait till you're at that point to do something about it. So backing it up and having a much more useful definition, it goes like this. It's what we have down here that says, the definition is that in spite of significant damage to my life, I'm unable to maintain a moderate use. Okay? And that gets, and we're going to talk some about how it damages your life in a second, but that's the key thing, is when we said that, you know, periods of complete self-enforced abstinence, you know, are diagnostic of alcoholism. They do not disprove it. And so I can think about in my own history with friends and family. I had one friend who's a phenomenally disciplined guy. I mean, he could pretty much do whatever he chose to do just because he chose to do it. And so he'd struggled with the alcohol issue for a long time, and I was concerned about him from an early time, but you know, he did all these other things. So I can remember for one period of time, for 2 years, he just self-enforced. He didn't drink. He just didn't drink. But then when he did let himself have one, then a few months later I see him having 3. A few months later he's having 6, and so on, and it just kind of goes downhill. So the idea here is not that I can stop. That's a sign of alcoholism, because people who are moderate don't stop. It's more the issue of I can't become moderate. Now the other kind of key thing I want to throw in here is this, is that well, I remember having this conversation with another one of my friends going back, you know, decades ago when we were facing some of these issues, and talking with him some about my concerns for him. And I talked about the idea of moderate, and when I finished that sentence, he said, "You mean like a 6-pack?" Well, no, I don't mean like a 6-pack. You know, that by itself answers every question you have about whether or not there's a problem. You know, moderate would mean 2 measured 1.5-ounce drinks, 2 standard cans of beer, 2 6-ounce glasses of wine, that sort of thing. Clearly measured moderate use. If you can't consistently be moderate, then what it means is there is addictive pattern starting in you. Now, the other way that we look at defining it is damage in your life. Now, we know this whole denial thing takes place, so people will distort the damage in their life and pretend it's not there or blame it on somebody else or something like that. But we have to look objectively at that. So I'm going to walk through some of the major areas of life and what this can do to you. The first thing we go to is, you know, not that this is the most important, but it's sort of one of the most tangible ones, is financial damage. Okay? Talk about basically $249 billion in the U.S. is estimated loss. That might even be on the low side. The damage is done in so many forms, and the biggest one is probably underperforming in one's career, but also significant medical costs that are associated with it, huge medical costs are associated with it, you know, and things like car wrecks and other kind of damage. So all kinds of things that really damage us financially. But more specifically, we can get into things like, you know, psychologically, has there been damage, okay? Any kind of mood-enhancing, euphoria-creating drug is always working on a principle of borrowing, okay, or running up credit, okay. You use up all of the ability to be happy through the time use of that drug, and then you're depleted of it. And so if I drink alcohol tonight, then tomorrow my brain is depleted of a lot of the neurotransmitters and the sensitivities in my brain that make me happy. So however good I felt last night is how crummy I'll feel the next day. Now, it's not quite that simple, because it's more over a period of time that it gets worse and worse. But chronic use of alcohol, one, makes people depressed, just in and of itself physiologically. The other one is that anxiety can be a piece of this as well. One, because if you're drinking alcohol, you create damage in your life, therefore you get less secure. But also, what you got to remember is that there's no such thing as a free lunch. So if I depress my nervous system and get myself really, really relaxed from alcohol, then it starts to bounce back the next day. It doesn't just go back to the standard, the normal level, but it goes back up in a commensurate curve. So you actually will create anxiety. Ultimately, this is where things like DTs come from if you drink chronically. But the other one is that you actually create anxiety. So these are some of the examples, but anxiety and depression are some of the most common things that you'd see from chronic alcohol use. Family damage, all kinds of damage. Talk about that 10% of U.S. children have parents who struggle with alcoholism. In the early 1980s, the literature just proliferated with the concept of adult children of alcoholics, and many folks are still really attuned to that. Just a recognition that says you wake up in that kind of unstable, insecure home, you will develop predictable kinds of psychological struggle. And so when we really look at this, I think 10% is probably a low estimate, but the damage is tremendous, and then it just proliferates out from there to their children and so on. Abuse, physical abuse is a very big thing happening in these kind of families, but even if it isn't physical abuse, it's emotional abuse, or it's neglect, or it's just instability and insecurity, but one way or another it's very damaging to families. Physical, basically alcohol is a toxin. That's the simplest way to say it. You know, a modest amount of it gives you a pleasant euphoria, your body clears of it, and if you don't drink too much, you don't have a hangover the next day. But it is basically a toxin, so it damages every organ system. We think first about things like liver. You know, chronic use of alcoholism creates alcoholic hepatitis and eventually a cirrhotic liver, but also it affects everything. You look at the skin of somebody who's chronically alcoholic, it looks really bad. It looks like they are, 30 years older than their years. Every single part of us, certainly our GI tract is greatly damaged, our kidneys are damaged. Pretty much every part of your body ends up being damaged by this chronic kind of use. Marriage, 60% of physical abuse is alcohol related. That's probably a really very realistic kind of estimate, because people lose emotional control. And so great damage to marriage. The number of divorces are inquantifiable. Career, lack of advancement and loss of a career. Lack of advancement is the least one. In some cases, basically, you have somebody who's chronically alcoholic. They're not out of control in the work environment. They sort of trudge along in their job, but their lack of energy, their lack of clarity, some missed days and so on, means that all they do is barely maintain that position. They're not really doing well for themselves. They're certainly not doing a lot for their employer. More so, we get things like we say loss of career, but also just loss of job. And if you lose your job, then what it means is the next one you get is probably not going to be quite as good, so there's a slow deterioration. If you have a license like a physician or an attorney or whatever, then that can actually be taken from you. So really significant damage done there. Spiritually, it's kind of a tough one to define, because we're not really selling a particular version of spirituality, but just saying that there's some fundamental concepts of spirituality, and one is our intimate interconnectedness with all other beings. The book I'm going to talk with you about in a minute talks about addictions, diseases of isolation, heal addictions, restore community. That we find spirituality in its most basic form in our connection to other human beings. And although alcohol is often used to facilitate connection on the front end, ultimately what it does is it creates disconnection. And so you want to look at something that has to do with a sense of purpose, a sense of connection in the world. So the simple way to say all of this is, one, despite significant damage in one's life, you are not able to consistently moderate your use. Again, not quit, but moderate it. If you'll fulfill that, then you are one. Okay? I'm going to talk some more in our second presentation that's much more lengthy and involved. It talks about how we face that for ourselves, how we work that through. I've lived with this situation where a number of immediate family members, extended family members, close friends have become alcoholic, and that is it's a very confusing experience. And so having this principle to start with is a really nice way to start. So what I'd ask for you to do is in the description box below, I would ask for you to take a look at a couple of the books that we have available in our real-life collections, and they are Addictions, Diseases of Isolation, Heal Addictions, Restore Community, and also Mental Health Issues, Loss of Joy Within Self, Loss of Peace and Joy Within Self. And so these will be available below, so I invite you to buy them. They're very cheap, and they're really good reads, good, short, clear, factually based, reality-based reads. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And please hold on for the next presentation that will follow on with this.